Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Actually, let me turn on my video. That may help. Thank you for joining us today for the Summer Science Speaker Series. This used to be our annual fundraising lunch, but for reasons I am sure you are all aware of, we cannot be sitting together at the Tahoe City Yacht Club. I trust you're all well and continuing to stay healthy during this extraordinary time. Before we get going, I wanted to acknowledge and thank the sponsors for today's event. They would be Truckee Tahoe Airport District and Bubba and Susan Crutchfield. And I would also like to thank those people and businesses that support our monthly seminar series in general. They would be Paul and Alice Baker, Tim and Betsy Kozier, David and Dana Lowry, the Muralados Lakeshore Resort, and Paul and Vicky Twitchell. My name is Geoff Schladow, the director of the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. And I'm very pleased to be welcoming you back to your computer monitors and to the first in our summer speaker presentations. The next one of these is actually a week from today at this time. It's the annual State of the Lake Report, and I hope that you all be able to attend that as well. So today Turk would like to inspire you. Turk would like to challenge you, and above all, to present to you where you now as private citizens, public agencies, our scientific colleagues, Tahoe residents, visitors, or just lovers of Lake Tahoe. We want to present you with an opportunity and an invitation to participate in an exciting new venture. You're the first to learn of this. This hasn't been unveiled previously. If you love Lake Tahoe, if you value the restoration and preservation of magnificent lakes everywhere, then we hope you accept our invitation. And if you're a lover of dogs, you will be especially excited. I'll start today by giving you a brief introduction to the history and the science that brought us to this point. I won't be speaking for very long. I will then be handing over the main part of the presentation to my two colleagues. First, I will be introducing Dr. Harold Schmitz from the Graduate School of Management at UC Davis and from the March Fund. Harold will be placing in a broader social context the nature of the challenge that we here at Tahoe face. Then he'll be followed by Mr. Yuan Cheng. Yuan is a recent graduate from the MBA program at UC Davis, and he is the lead of this new social enterprise. And he will introduce this opportunity to you. Finally, possibly for the last half hour, we'd like to interact with you, our audience, and address questions you might have through a Q&A session. Sadly, we cannot deal with open mics, so I would ask that you use the Q&A function. Depending on your Zoom settings, this will either be an icon at the top or the bottom of your screen. You may have to wiggle your mouse to activate it, but it's there. Feel free to type in questions during the presentation. We'll endeavor to get as many of them answered as possible today. And if that's not possible, we'll follow up offline. There are also going to be 3 short surveys popping up during the presentation. The first of these should be up any time now. The second and third will be up during Ewan's presentation. It just popped up and blocked my notes. So let me just move that off to the side. We hope you'll take the time to respond to all 3, as the data you can provide is very important to us. So with that as an introduction, let me start my remarks, at least my my placing in context where we are with regard to history and science. So, in the beginning, and we're not really sure when the beginning was, but Lake Tahoe is 2 million years old. So sometime between now and 2 million years ago, there was this beginning of a big blue clear lake. And the humblest creature living in this lake was the Daphnia, sometimes known as the water flea because of the way it jumps around in the water. Okay, so life was pretty good if you're a Daphnia. You got to live at Lake Tahoe, you ate at will, and you had sex. That was life. So I'm not sure of the makeup of the audience, so I'll try to keep this very general and just talk about the eating part of that. So what did Daphnia eat? Well, Daphnia ate very small things. First, you have to remember that the Daphnia itself is quite small. So it's about 100 microns long. All you have to remember about that is the number 100. So what it ate were tiny algae. So these little green dots representing algae, they're about 1 or 2 microns in size. So about a 50th of the size of the Daphnia. And then silt that got washed in hundreds, thousands of years ago from the surrounding watershed, that again was the size of about 1 or 2 microns. So it was eating things that were about a 50th of its size. And it could consume about 100,000 of these every hour. So it was voracious. And that was pretty much its life. Okay, fast forward to the 1960s. So the 1960s, as we all know, was a time of unplanned development at Lake Tahoe. New roads, new businesses, new houses, things being built in bad places in the watershed. And that result of all of that was there was a huge influx of nutrients and silt and other fine material to the lake. It was also a time when sewers in the Tahoe Basin were all septic tanks that ultimately leached to the lake. So controlling these inputs was seen as a solution to the decline in clarity, which started to become evident in the 1960s. At the same time, in the 1960s, there was something else happening, and that was the introduction of the Mysis shrimp. So this was introduced to Lake Tahoe in 1963 by both California and Nevada Fish and Wildlife departments with the idea of improving the fishery, making the fish more plentiful and larger. And this was a technique that was being used all over the West. So it wasn't just a Tahoe initiative. So within less than 10 years, the Mysis had consumed pretty much all the Daphnia. They annihilated them. And not just Daphnia, but very similar species, Buzz minor. So it changed everything lower than it on the food web. It also had profound effects on things higher in the food web, the fish at Lake Tahoe, and they weren't the changes that the Mysis was introduced to produce. So generally, it was seen as an ecological mistake, possibly disaster, but certainly a mistake, not just at Tahoe, but at dozens of lakes around the Western US where it was introduced. So if you haven't seen Mysis before, and very few people have, I'd like to share this video with you. It was, well, doesn't seem to be, okay, now it's playing. So this was taken during the day, but at the bottom of Lake Tahoe, it's the reason you can see the Mysis there is that there were lights on this robotic vehicle that was taking this. So what you can hopefully see is thousands upon thousands of these tiny Mysis moving around as part of this continuous carpet across the bottom of the lake. Okay, so 2011, a band of intrepid researchers set out for Emerald Bay. And the reason I call them intrepid is that it was November, when it's typically very cold at Tahoe, and it was nighttime when it's even colder. And the reason it was nighttime is Mysis don't like the light, so it's only at night that they rise up off the bottom and come up to the surface. And what these intrepid Mysis researchers discovered is shown on that graph on the right. They were out there to sample Mysis, and what they found at the beginning of that graph is that Mysis numbers were very low. That dashed green line shows what the concentration of Mysis typically was in Emerald Bay, and actually very similar to that for Lake Tahoe itself. The two water bodies are very similar in their populations of Mysis and other things. So literally, they went out and measured nothing by way of Mysis. So they were also taking other samples as well. They took zooplankton samples, and they were able to count Daphnia populations. And as if you were paying attention, you would have heard me say that Daphnia had been annihilated by Mysis. So let me put on the line there of what the Daphnia populations had been in Emerald Bay and in Lake Tahoe. So pretty much zero. So looking at these two graphs, they're both highly unusual. Mysis, on all those sampling days, were very much below the historical values. Daphnia suddenly appeared from the dead, reappeared from the dead, and were there in large numbers, 5,000 per cubic meters. They went out the next day, or 1 or 2 days following these evening samplings, and they measured the Secchi depth, the clarity of Emerald Bay. And this is what they measured. So Emerald Bay is not as clear as Lake Tahoe. Typically, its clarity is around 40 feet. What they found during this 2-year period is that clarity consistently improved down to about 80 feet, actually to a point where it was clearer than Lake Tahoe, which in our 50 years of measuring Secchi depth, we've never observed this. And so this was a sustained trend, or 3 sustained trends over this 2-year period. So adding the data for the remaining 4 years, we see what happened is that things reversed themselves. Starting in about 2014, Mysis numbers came up again to what they had been originally. Daphnia numbers started to decrease progressively down at the end to about 0, which is about the same rate of decline that was observed when they were when Mysis were first introduced. And the Secchi depth, the clarity of the lake, that went down, returned down to what it had been before, around 40 feet. So to summarize this 6-year experiment, curiosity-driven research led to a new realization. And that is, if Mysis are absent, Daphnia can return. And more importantly, for us, clarity returns as well. So this nexus between Mysis, Daphnia, and clarity had never been made before. We knew that the nexus between Mysis and Daphnia, but that it impacted clarity, was totally new. And so what this posed was the possibility of a powerful new tool for Lake Tahoe's restoration, one that has climate change insurance built in. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. So to summarize by way of a cartoon, so this is the pre-1963 conditions in Lake Tahoe. This is before the introduction of Mysis. So you see the Daphnia, you see the small algae, you see the small pieces of silt. You also see a large alga there because they were really the dominant alga at the time. So what we now believe happened after this time is the following. We had the introduction of Mysis. Their numbers grew and grew. I'm here representing that by the Mysis itself growing, but its numbers grew. It consumed the Daphnia. It consumed the large algae. Suddenly, there was no removal of small algae and silt by Daphnia, and despite efforts to control runoff into the basin, into the lake, numbers of fine particles, numbers of fine algae increase. Clarity declined, and in that time since then, particularly in the last 20 years, something like $1 to $2 billion has been spent trying to restore clarity. And that has been met with, let's say, partial success. So let me show you that record. This is a figure many of you are familiar with. It's showing the annual average Secchi depth at Lake Tahoe. So back at the beginning, it was around 30 meters or 100 feet. And for about 30 years, there was pretty much a linear decline. In the last 20 years, there's been a flattening of this trend. But I guess evidence available to date is not making it seem that we can return to where our goals are. These are the goals for the state of California and the state of Nevada, and even the federal government and all agencies and all research institutions. The goal of restoring Lake Tahoe's clarity to 97 feet. So the next step in this saga is we were fortunate enough to conduct a pilot project. This was funded by the California Tahoe Conservancy and the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. And the goal of this was to see whether we could deliberately remove Mysis from Emerald Bay. Everything I presented to now was a big experiment that was delivered to us. The Mysis disappeared. We're not sure how, we have theories, but they disappeared from Emerald Bay and we recorded the consequences. The question now is, can we make that happen? Can we deliberately remove Mysis? And then how do we catch them? To remove them, when do we catch them? Where in Emerald Bay do we catch them? And can we optimize this process? So it's more than just a research experiment, but one that maybe could be turned into more of an industrial process. So the final report for this pilot project is being turned in about 2 weeks from now, but I don't think I'm revealing anything that I shouldn't by saying yes to all of those questions. We know how to catch Mysis now. We know when and where, and we know how to optimize the process. 2 questions remain, and this is where we are now. How do we upscale this? And can we do this in a way to commercialize it, actually market the catch? If you think about it, it's like asking a fisherman in San Francisco or Santa Barbara to go out fishing all day with his crew on his boat and bring in salmon or crabs or calamari, and when they get back to port, throw away their catch. No, they sell their catch. That's how they stay in the business. Can we do the same at Lake Tahoe? So I said, this is where we are right now. We have a lot of ideas on the upscaling. It has to be smart. Finding shrimp in Lake Tahoe is a lot different than finding them in Emerald Bay. Ideas of autonomous electric trawlers are being discussed. And the marketability, which is what Yuan will be talking about, is there is a great market opportunity for very high purity, high health, high-end dog treats, of all things. So our challenge, and this is the challenge we're presenting you, is how do we truly restore Lake Tahoe? So till now, we're focused on restoration as being the metric of of clarity. Clarity represents the improvement of the environmental condition of Lake Tahoe, but it isn't really. There's a whole broader question of ecosystem health, and removing an invasive species and allowing the native food web to return and allowing the fish populations to readjust to what they had been is closer to true ecosystem health. The other big question as part of this challenge is, can we do it sustainably? There's not going to be, at least in my humble opinion, another $1 to $2 billion to bring us from where we are now with clarity to where we want to be. So sustainability is the real key. So to continue this discussion of a challenge, the challenge we face, and possibly a grand challenge, I'd like to introduce Harold Schmitz. You read his biography before, and I'm going to stop now and allow him to continue.
Okay. Can people hear me, Jeff?
Yes, I can, so I presume everybody else can.
All right, if you can, I'm going to assume everybody else can. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I'm a part-time resident for the polling data up there, so I have a personal affinity for the Tahoe region as well as a scientific interest in it. I'm actually talking to you guys, despite the background image, I'm talking to you from Davis proper. Was hoping to come up and do this all in person, but we all know the reason why that wasn't possible. So the real answer to Jeff's question, I could just sort of cut to the chase. If you see the shirt that I'm wearing, it has Mars on it. I used to be the chief science officer for Mars, and there's even some old chocolate stains on this side of the shirt. But if we just cover the Mysis shrimp in chocolate, we'll be able to sell all that we need to. So that's the answer. Of course, I'm just kidding. So I'm gonna talk to you about some lessons that I learned in my years at Mars. It was a great opportunity to work for one of the world's largest food companies. It was also a privately held company. And the Mars family had a particular interest in science, technology, and innovation. And so I had a chance to do a lot of learning and experimentation in that context. And I'm going to use a technique that is very, very effective when we're talking about innovation and how to go from curiosity-driven research to use-inspired research and actually commercialization, which Yuan will talk about at the end here. And the technique is something that you do with your iPhone camera. When you take a photo and want to look at stuff, you zoom out and you zoom in. So I'm going to zoom out massively to give you some perspective on how to sort of take what Jeff talked about specific to Lake Tahoe and the curiosity-driven research, where that fits, and then how to zoom in to what Yuan has been piloting and proposing with the team at UC Davis, and where this could possibly lead from a product perspective. So do you want to, thank you. So the next slide here is just, these are the topics that I'm gonna cover in terms of opportunities in sustainability and innovation. Grand challenges, it's a framework in how to think about this. Jeff said this is possibly a grand challenge that you guys are dealing with. I would agree, it possibly is. There's a gentleman named Vannevar Bush who sort of thought about things in an important way during the post-World War II era to put curiosity-driven research into context, and then a construct called Pasteur's Quadrant, and then our very own Silicon Valley here in the Northern California Tahoe region, and plenty of people, and probably plenty of people in this audience today have some relationship to the Bay Area and Silicon Valley and the wealth that's created. And I guess what I would what I'd want to say is that everybody in business loves to talk about creating, doing well by doing good. And what that means is monetizing opportunities, commercially that actually are not exploitative or extractive, but actually end up contributing to sustainability and health. And it definitely is possible. There are examples, but it requires a very thoughtful approach to the innovation process to do that. So we'll walk through that. Next slide. So when we think about a grand challenge, it's great the most commonly used example is actually the United States putting a human being onto the moon. And so it's very easy to, again, talk about, and use the words grand and challenges, and you can, sort of flow into that conversation. Great to talk about over wine in the evening, and it all sounds so big and doable, and all that sort of thing. The real technique that that needs to be employed is actually creating a grand challenge framework, understanding where it came from, why you want to pursue it, and what are the milestones that are required to do it. And so the NASA experience in the going to the moon is really quite illuminating with this. So how did it happen? Well, it happened because in 1957 the Soviet Union put a satellite up into space called Sputnik, and it went around the world and beeping, and it flew, went right over the United States. And it was really, really clear that at that very nanosecond moment that the US was facing not only a grand challenge, but an existential challenge, or at least they thought they were at the time, the leadership, and that, hey, if the Soviets can fly a satellite over our airspace at will, they might be able to drop things from that same satellite or future satellites at will onto our territory. So that was literally overnight an existential challenge, and and that was converted into a grand challenge, which was, how does the United States retake ownership of its future from a national security perspective, make sure that we control that airspace, and make sure that we have superior technology, innovation, and ability to deliver from space. And so the grand challenge construct that was created was, hey, let's inspire the country to work together on a shared goal, which is not a fear-based goal, which is how do we stop the Soviets from dropping atomic weapons on us from space, but is in fact a very positive, inspirational come-together challenge, which is how do we, for the betterment of humanity, actually put humans onto the moon, explore, learn new things. And it's great for the US, obviously the flag there, but it's also great for humanity. So how do you bring people together and inspire them around a positive framework? And then how do you also then create a milestone framework so that it's not just people getting inspired and then dumping billions of dollars into it, walking away, and then seeing what happens 10 years later. As everybody knows, there was Apollo 1, there was Apollo 2, 3, 4, 5, there's Apollo 11 that actually brought the person to the moon, or the people to the moon, and there were programs before that as well. So it was an extremely well thought out, milestone driven program. We knew where it came from, and we knew where we were going. We knew what the grand challenge was. So that's one framework. Another framework then is this person, Vannevar Bush, that I referred to. And on this slide, you see on the left side, if you're looking at the computer as I am, you see an atomic explosion, which ended World War II. So obviously the US was in an existential sort of challenge period then, resolved that existential challenge through the Manhattan Project, creating atomic weapons, and then utilizing those to end the war. And then the question became, hey, how do we make sure and we never have to have another world war. How do we utilize this unprecedented new power, which is very controversial, needless to say, and actually, to the best of our ability, use it going forward in a way to preserve peace rather than create, more death and destruction. And so what Vannevar Bush did at the behest of first FDR, and then of course FDR died and Truman came onto the scene, was Vannevar Bush was commissioned to put a strategy together. And he put a strategy together and published a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. And you can see him on the right side of the slide there with that endless frontier piece. And in the middle is a picture of Lawrence Livermore, so keeping it local here in Northern California. That's Ernest O. Lawrence, E.O. Lawrence, who won the Nobel Prize, was a faculty member at Berkeley, actually turned down leadership in the Manhattan Project for various reasons, suggested Oppenheimer, so on and so forth. The point there was that Vannevar Bush said, look, we need to invest deeply into basic research because that's how we got to the bomb. So that's the curiosity-driven research. Then that will, in a linear fashion, go from basic research, curiosity-driven research, to application, so product development, to put it in industry and venture capital terms. And then from there, it'll be invested in and it'll be commercialized. But it's a linear path. And that was a great construct. It resulted in massive investment by the United States into science and technology. The US, subsequently became the world's leading science and technology power. And it worked pretty well, that linear path. However, some cracks started to appear in the 80s and 90s because it was linear, therefore it was highly inefficient, because for that to work well, there needs to be more of a cycle. And then also what it did is it opened things up so that other countries could come in and cherry pick leading science and technologies, basically take advantage of the US investment to go build their own products and stuff. So anyway, so that was the linear process of Vannevar Bush. And that's where the sort of theory of curiosity-driven research and its benefits came from. Next slide. So then this fellow named Donald Stokes out of Princeton said, it's great that the US has this endless frontier approach, but we need to make it more economically productive. And here's where you definitely start to hear echoes of what I'm saying and what I learned, during my years as a CSO and leader of transformative innovation, and what Jeff was saying earlier, which is, through curiosity-driven research, which would be the Niels Bohr quadrant, pure basic research. So Niels Bohr studied physics and atoms at a very basic research level, did not really care what happened to that, was just really interested, curiosity-driven research. And then, as Jeff said, though, it'd be great if actually that curiosity-driven research could lead to a marketable and therefore sustainable output that could provide income to create a sustainable solution. That marketable output would be in the Edison quadrant, so bottom right, pure applied research. So that's where someone like Thomas Edison, he didn't care why something worked, he only cared if it worked. And if it worked, he was going to figure out how to patent it, create an invention and go make money out of it. That's what, so Bohr on the one hand only cares about why something works, doesn't care, it doesn't care how it gets applied. Edison doesn't care why, just wants to know if it does and then go make money out of it. And where the magic happens from an innovation perspective and getting to this sort of sustainable vision that Jeff was painting as a possibility is through this concept of use-inspired basic research. And Louis Pasteur was a great example of that, and that's who Don Stokes used as his, that's why he calls this Pasteur's quadrant. It's like, hey, if you can get the university people, the academic, the ivory academic tower people, and the cold-blooded, go for the jugular industry people to quit fighting with each other and saying each other is wasting money or doing the wrong thing, but actually come together in that use-inspired basic research quadrant. Instead of arguing about the money that's spent, they can actually work together to figure out how to get return on investment, ROI, from that money that's spent in a commercial way that actually builds on the basic research. And so I think, you know, what Jeff really elegantly laid out, and Yuan will talk about in Edisonian terms, is how to take that curiosity-driven research that was referred to in Emerald Bay, what was learned there, and then, you know, couple it with a market idea, but there's still some research to do, but that research should not be done by, with an attitude of, hey, give us some money, come back in 5 years, see what we discovered. It should actually be, give us some money. And by the way, the reason you're giving us some money, whether you're a granting agency or venture capitalist or whoever, is because we're inspired by a commercial application we think can come out of this. So that's the use-inspired basic research. And then the last piece of this sort of, you know, zoom out big sort of construct is Silicon Valley, and I refer to it, and there's a book called Geography of Genius, which is a great read if you guys are looking for a summertime read and haven't already read it. But each chapter deals with a geographic center of brilliance throughout history. Starts with Athens, talks about Edinburgh, Scotland, Hangzhou, China, Vienna, so on and so forth. And the last chapter is on Silicon Valley and talks about you know, why they occur, and you know, one common theme is that none of them ever stick around forever. They all go through a life cycle, but it's really interesting to see why each particular center of brilliance comes together for the time it does. But I wanted to include this because Silicon Valley is part of, and should be, you know, it's part of our geographic reality here, and we should leverage the brilliance of that from an innovation perspective to actually work on this use-inspired research situation that Jeff has laid out, and perhaps commercial opportunity that Yuan is going to lay out. And great examples of this are Gates and Jobs there on the far left. As many of you know, they actually collaborated together as young men. Great example of use-inspired research with the Edisonian sort of, you know, at play part. Of course, what maybe they did or did not know was that the reason they had an opportunity to create what they did was because of the Niels Bohr type of Vannevar Bush endless frontier of science that had been plowed into California as a result of World War II and the post-war era, and then they were able to harvest that and do what they did. Closer to home on the you know, consuming a technology-based product, the center image is of Pat Brown and the Impossible Burger, which is this non-animal, you know, product containing hamburger, which is heavily technology-based, but, you know, the use inspiration was how do we not use beef cattle in order to create something that people love and want to eat and want to pay a lot of money for. So that's sort of the big picture of zooming out. I wanted to give you a slightly start to zoom in before Yuan really zooms in with a laser focus on Tahoe and the Mysis opportunity. And that's to talk about a personal case study when I was at Mars, working with chocolate and the sustainability crisis that faced the industry and the industry still faces. And so the existential crisis, or the grand challenge for the global chocolate industry, which began to be understood in the late 80s and early 90s, was that the raw material, cocoa, came from a highly fragile, completely undeveloped and highly exploited part of the world, which are the neotropics around the world. And so sustainable agriculture is not a concept, really. They are certainly not then. It's becoming more of a concept as we appreciate what the tropics do, but that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And so I can tell you that we spent tens of millions of dollars on that. It wasn't working. And so this is when I really got to know and love the Bush and Stokes models, and we really examined those, used those to figure out a framework to come up with use inspiration research and common platforms where communities come together and create products that have commercial value that actually deliver on the sustainable needs that are of interest. So next slide. So just to walk through this quickly, sustainable agriculture in the tropics. Here's the slash and burn farming on the left, which is, by the way, widely used to create regions for cocoa cultivation. And then on the right actually is a sustainability challenge, which is as you put cocoa into this, sort of alien environment from an evolution perspective, which is, tree crop farming like we'd see in the Central Valley with almonds and walnuts and such, pistachio. That's not how cocoa grew up. And so all of a sudden there's disease pressures and, things start happening like what happened with Lake Tahoe. It went from clear to cloudy because new pests and diseases, if you will, were introduced into the picture. And so we started to understand that, yes, there's the large-scale farming aspect, and then there's also the sustainability aspect to do with new pests and diseases that threaten the ecosystem and product we're talking about. So from the application of the Bush and Stokes models, what we did is we said, hey, on the left-hand side of this slide, as you look at it, this gentleman named Howard Shapiro. He's actually here at UC Davis. He was our chief agriculture officer for many, many years. And Howard was and still is a world leader in sustainable agriculture. And so he developed a program which we then built into a strategy which borrowed from the Bush model initially, which was we cannot create a community to come together to work productively on solving this issue unless we can create a scientific platform that is reliable and actually creates a space where there's data that can be used to come together. I think for the Mysis shrimp, we heard about from Jeff the understanding of the Daphnia relationship, understanding more and more about Emerald Bay, so on and so forth. For cocoa, it was that there is no crop on the face of the planet that does not benefit from understanding its genetic composition or its genome. And that's the common basic research platform that has to be in place so that scientists can come together, create better, and it can be through traditional breeding methods or genetically modified organism type of methods or things in between. So, please don't misinterpret it if you have concerns about GMO. There is no GMO cocoa that's out there. However, there is increasingly better and more resistant cocoa varieties to pest and disease that can be grown more sustainably that were developed through accelerated traditional breeding programs because the genome was sequenced. On the right-hand part of the slide, and this was a very helpful piece from the use inspiration in getting another community to come together, was we actually did the chemical composition of cocoa, much like people understand the composition of Lake Tahoe from a biology perspective. And when we did that, we actually understood that there were chemicals in raw cocoa that would enable significant unprecedented effects from a nutrition perspective in terms of cardiovascular health. And so that created an entirely new commercial opportunity for cocoa that had little to do with creating high-fat, high-sugar chocolate, and a lot to do with creating new products that were not high-fat, were not sugar, had a lot of cocoa, and could actually lower blood pressure and address issues like that. So that created the platform. In fact, new, healthier chocolate, and that's the newspaper headline. It was really non-chocolate products were developed. Communities started to come together there. Breeding communities based on the genetic understanding started to come together, and new varieties of cocoa started to come out of that community interaction, and we end up getting commercial products and outcomes that actually matter commercially and drive the sustainable interests. That was the core of the challenge to begin with, and the beauty of it is you almost don't even, people don't even know it's happening. and which is when you know you're succeeding. If you're making a crop and an ecosystem more sustainable and people don't know it's happening, that's great, because it means they're doing stuff by instinct and behavior that is driving this. So it's a virtuous cycle rather than a unvirtuous cycle, such as the one that Jeff talked about in the 1960s in Lake Tahoe. Next slide. So, I just talked about where this leads to. So if you do the use-inspired research properly, then and you think about it thoughtfully, and you actually get communities such as the people represented in the audience today, and the greater community that we could hopefully pull together, including, we have this incredibly powerful community node called the University of California system, including UC Davis. As part of that, there's some great things that we could accomplish that would derive from use-inspired research, and also create commercializable opportunities that would keep this virtuous cycle spinning. So the last slide that I'll comment on, and then we'll do the zoom in with Yuan, and Jeff will introduce in a moment, is that if you sort of think about the lessons that I described, the zoom out, and you look forward in terms of what's on the table with Lake Tahoe, just to speak candidly and bluntly and maybe a little bit harshly, as Jeff said, there's no way probably there's going to be another $1 to $2 billion to put into this. So the real challenge, if you love Lake Tahoe, which I do, I know everybody else here does, then we need to think about how to get a sustainable economic cycle that allows for investment into R&D that's use-inspired, that can spin out products that can make money and be run by responsible businesses, and there can be a virtuous cycle that is created. So those are the opportunities. So be honest about what the crisis is with Lake Tahoe, or the challenge, and be honest about what it's going to take to solve it. Last comment is Mars, in addition to being the world's leading chocolate company, is the world's leading pet food manufacturer. And I can tell you, because I have sat through, half of my life has been sitting through pet food and treat and veterinary health opportunities, presentations, research. This is actually a viable opportunity that Jeff and Yuan have come up with Mysis and pet food. There's you've got to think about the innovation structure and the business plan and all those sorts of usual things, but it's definitely a viable opportunity in a market that could support something that is pretty compelling. And I'm really excited about it. The reason I ended up leaving Mars was to go to the March Fund, because I wanted to really focus more fully on supporting people like Jeff and Yuan to really bring these sort of small zoom in opportunities to life, so that they could grow and really participate in the zoom out picture in the future. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys.
Thank you very much, Harold. That was great. And we can certainly take a lot of inspiration from that and from the experience you had at Mars. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Yuan Cheng. There's a little bit of a story here. Last year, we teamed up with a group of students from the Graduate School of Management program. They chose us, or our project on Mysis, as something they wanted to explore to see did it have any marketability. There was about 6 or 7 of them. They came up with some great ideas, and Yuan was one of the students, probably the most, in my opinion anyway, ambitious and excited students in that group, and he is deciding to continue to run with this idea. So with that, I would like to introduce Yuan Cheng.
Hey everyone, this is Yuan here. Good to meet you all virtually. So before I dive into my section of the presentation on the commercial side, I'll take us through a short and fun exercise, because probably the #1 question we always get is, what does mysis actually taste like? Now, unfortunately, this is a virtual event, so you guys won't be able to be eating the mysis yourselves today, but we'll do the next best thing, which is a poll for you guys to select what you think the mysis will taste like. And I have here a nice fresh mysis that I will eat and walk you guys through the culinary experience. So go ahead and fill out that poll right now. I see some of the results coming in. All right, that's a nice even distribution there. All right, 2 more seconds on the poll. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and eat this now. It looks like the current winner is sardines. And hopefully you guys can see this. They are very small, as you can see. And here goes. Okay, so initially, I probably overcooked this because everything tastes like popcorn. Everything tastes like chicken. There is a slight sweetness to them and a lot of overt brininess, that I would say. So of that list of 5, I think, options there, if I had to choose one, I would go with sea urchins, given the slight sweetness and kind of that overt brininess. It's not a bad flavor. It is a strong flavor. Jeff, I think I might need to go with that, and it could be pretty good. So congratulations to those of you that chose sea urchins. Next time you're over at the Turk facility, make sure to ask Jeff for a fresh sample of mysis so you can. All right, dive into the slides here. Okay. All right, a surprisingly tasty solution to Tahoe's mysis problem. First off, just let me introduce myself a little bit more formally. Again, my name is Yuan, just like the famous actor Ewan McGregor, but unfortunately without the same charming good looks. And I think I did a program. Prior to that, I spent about 10 years in the software industry working on the likes of product management, sales operations, customer loyalty. I really chose UC Davis though for my MBA because I specifically wanted to make a career switch from software to food and agriculture, and ultimately in hopes of being a part of designing and creating food systems that would lead to a healthier, more sustainable planet. As you can imagine, I am very excited to be working with Jeff and Harold on this project and to be sharing with you all this afternoon. So before we jump in, one question that I would like you all to be thinking about today. As a member of Tahoe community, is this something you'd be excited to support and proud to be a part? Okay, like Harold just shared, you can have the best research and the best commercial intentions, but in order for it to come together and actually drive sustainable change, you have to have community support and community engagement. And so this is that we like to be thinking about. So the first thing I want to hit on is vision. Okay, the vision of who we want to be as a company and as an organization. The reason I want to start here is because so often when we hear the words commercial, we immediately think economics, money, profitability. And while all that is important, that's actually goal number 3 for us. Okay, goal number 1 is the environment. Right? Ultimately, the reason we're harvesting the mysis is because we want to see Tahoe's local ecosystem restored, and we want to see the Daphnia return, we want to see water clarity improve. And so the environment is definitely goal number 1. Goal number 2 is awareness and public education. As you guys all know, Tahoe isn't just an icon of California and Nevada, it's the rest of the world on the negative and far-reaching effects of invasive species, but also, hopefully, as we're successful, become a highlighted example of the type of research, commercial, and community collaboration it takes to actually solve these types of environmental challenges. The public about what's going on here. Thirdly, yes, economics. Right? We want to be economically sustainable and viable. What do we mean by that? Well, it means that the revenue we generate from sales should be able to cover at least the cost of operations and trawling, and our returns. But of course, where do those positive returns go? And here's where we want the positive returns to come full circle back to the environment and to creating awareness. But you talk about this idea of tight-knit collaboration between research, the community, and commercial. We believe that a nonprofit entity is actually the best way to achieve this because it ensures that any profitable revenue we generate at the end of the day gets funneled right back into supporting the environment and the local community. So ultimately, picture this, right? We want to be a company that is not only helping to restore Tahoe's local ecosystem, but also teaching the public about the dangers of invasive species. And every dollar donated to this cause has the potential to become future dollars that go right back into the environment and the local community. 3 goals, 1 regenerative system. That's the vision. You with me so far? So that in mind, what's the product? Now, if you know anything about Mysis, you're probably thinking fish food, right? Because fish love Mysis, right? Fish food makes a lot of sense. But other groups in other lakes in North America have already been doing this. And so if you remember that one of our goals is to generate awareness, you don't generate awareness by doing what's expected or doing what's already been done. So where do we want to go with this? Well, as Jeff mentioned earlier, Turk and team reached out to the UC Davis School of Management, and there were 6 of us MBA consultants that worked long, hard hours, late at night, looking at pretty much every possible market out there that would be a good fit for Mysis. We looked at everything from fish feed to fish oil supplements to, yes, even Mysis protein smoothies. And we landed on one surprising, but we believe very promising market. And that market, as you have probably already heard, is premium dog treats. Now, you might be thinking, dogs and Mysis, that's a strange connection, right? But there's actually a lot of really good reasons for the dog treat market and what makes it really attractive. First of all, people love dogs. People love talking about their dogs. Even people who don't have dogs love looking at cute pictures of dogs. And it's just something about dogs, I think, that helps us feel a little bit more connected and closer to nature, even when we're stuck in a big city, right? And so just from an awareness factor, I think the dog treat market is very attractive. But beyond that, when you dive in a little bit deeper, there's actually 3 key trends in the dog treat industry that are currently happening that I think really point us towards Tahoe Mysis treats being a really great product. The first of these trends is functional treats. And what do I mean by functional treats? 71% of dog owners are looking for treats that offer extra nutrition. And in particular, a lot of dog owners these days have been looking at omega-3 fatty acids, especially EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids, because those are helpful for improving dog skin, coat, and joint health. Well, thankfully, Professor Bell at UC Davis did some lipid analysis on the Mysis, and what we found is that as a dry ingredient, Tahoe Mysis actually has 14% more EPA, DHA, omega-3s, and 58% less fat than salmon. Now ask any vet, and they'll tell you that when it comes to dog treats, excess empty calories is the #1 enemy. And what we have here in the Mysis is a potential opportunity to create a dog treat that is not only exceptionally high in EPA and DHA omega-3s, but also lower calorie relatively than anything else comparable on the market. That's a potential winner right there. The second piece of this is sustainability, right? As we humans have become acutely aware of the fact that how and what we eat has a huge impact on the environment, this has thankfully started to spill over in how we feed our pets. If you look at some of the hottest newcomers to the pet treat industries, Wild Earth vegan pet treats, Jiminy's and Chip-In, cricket protein, Shameless Pets, upcycled ingredients. What do all of these companies have in common? A sustainable bent as part of their key value proposition, right? They're pushing sustainability. But when you think about Tahoe Mysis treats, we're not just sustainable, we're regenerative, right? We're not just trying to reduce the harm on the environment. We're actually saying that every bite of Tahoe Mysis treats directly impacts, in a positive way, Tahoe's ecosystem and Lake Tahoe's clarity. I think that's the type of measurable connection that consumers are looking for when they're talking about a sustainable, regenerative product. Lastly, trend #3 is humanizing. 81% of Americans now consider their dogs to be equal members of the family. And you've probably seen this trend if you've been hearing about doggy hotels and doggy spas and gourmet doggy menus out there, right? But when it comes to seeing dogs as family, I think it's all about being connected and sharing, right, with family. Well, I think the only thing I can think about that is more connecting than sharing, snuggles and cuddles with your puppy is sharing in mission and vision and purpose with your pet. And so that's the experience that we offer here with Tahoe Mysis Treats. It's you and your dog saving the planet together. So again, we take a step back and we think about this big picture of the dog treat market. At first, it seems surprising that Mysis would be a fit there, but I think the surprise factor actually helps us generate awareness. And more importantly, when you dig in a little bit deeper, Mysis checks the box on all three key trends here in ways that no other product on the market currently can. So where are we now and what's next? Well, we're currently in the process of designing our brand strategy and prototyping our initial product. Thankfully, as you know, my background is in software, so I will not be the one designing the product, but we've actually expanded the team well beyond the MBA at this point to have a fully interdisciplinary team from the UC Davis network. We have on the team Liz McAllister, who's a design major with helping us drive creative strategy. We have Lauren Chu, who's a fifth-year water resource engineer, helping us with our creative design and storytelling aspects. And then we also have Bisma Parwez and Maihan Wen, both fourth-year food scientists at UC Davis, who are going to be helping to drive the product development side of things. And I hope one thing that you see here on this team, first of all, it's exciting to work with this group because we are all fully committed to this idea of regenerative systems. But secondly, we're fully tapped into the expert research that goes on at UC Davis and that network there. And we believe it's this type of interdisciplinary connection, including talking with the vet school, which we're actively doing right now, that's going to be able to solve this type of grand challenge. So speaking of use-inspired research that both Jeff and Harold talked about, the next step for us and the major milestone that we're looking at is a pilot launch and a pilot study in fall of 2021 on Emerald Bay. Jeff mentioned the idea of scaling up, and this is exactly what we're trying to do. And this pilot would allow us to validate three key components of this venture at the same time. The first component would be the environmental side, right? So how quickly can we remove the mysis or suppress the mysis? Once suppressed, how quickly does the Daphnia return and how quickly does the water clarity improve? Question number one. Question number two on the research side in terms of trawl efficiency, as Turk is working to design that custom trawl, is cost constraints, right? What are the harvest efficiencies and can we get it optimized so that it falls within commercial cost constraints? And then number three, of course, is the commercial side. We've done a lot of market research and pricing studies, but nothing tells you about consumer demand than actually having a product that you can put out there and get customer feedback. So we're looking right here at one pilot launch, fall of 2021, but I think 18 months from now, we will have very good data on just what we can accomplish with this venture. But again, to just bring it back full circle to what Jeff and Harold have been talking about, we can have all these great ideas, but none of it happens without you guys as a community being excited about what we're doing, being proud about what we're doing, because we want to invite you guys to be part of the story. But at the end of the day, this isn't just research, it's just commerce. To me, this is a communal effort, and it's all three: research, community, commerce coming together to achieve great results and see what we can do to restore Lake Tahoe. So with that in mind, I'm gonna wrap things up here on my end. You're gonna see a quick poll because I do want to get your initial reaction to what was just shared. Please give us your honest answer, because what you say and how you're feeling right now is going to go a long way in helping us define next steps. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jeff for Q&A.
Well, thank you, Yuan. I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen again, which is proving to be quite a challenge for me. Is my screen visible? I guess you can't answer me, can you? Okay, I think I just figured out how to do it. Okay, I'm presuming you can now see that. So this is approaching the end of the formal presentation. And I mentioned before this challenge, and as Harold said, maybe it does rise to being a grand challenge, but there really is an existential question here of what do we want to do about it? Where a lot of money has been expended, a lot of great ideas have been tried over the last decades, really. And we're not here to say, oh, we have the one solution. We don't. We have what is really a complementary approach to what has been happening at Tahoe. And one of the questions we received was is this yet another solution? Are we putting all our eggs in just this Mysis basket? And, to answer that question, no, we're not. But combining what's being done in the watershed to reduce loads coming into Tahoe, what we have is another tool, let's say. But the existential question is, what do we want to do about it, given that we're unlikely to get a whole lot more money, or at least money on the scale of what Tahoe has received in the past? So the existential question that I would like to close with would be the following. Do we fish or do we cut bait? How much do we really want to work towards the complete environmental restoration of Lake Tahoe? And with that, I guess I'm going to start going through some of the questions and assigning either myself or Yuan or Harold to answer them as appropriate. So, and as a reminder, you can still send in questions. We would ask that you use the Q&A function at the top or the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. Makes it easier for us to keep track of. So one of the questions, one of the first questions we received was one relating to why did the Mysis disappear from Emerald Bay? Do we have any ideas? Is there anything in the data that we've collected that points to why they did disappear? And the answer is, well, yes, we do have ideas. Certainly one of them, and it's to my mind probably the most plausible, is that there is a difference between the Mysis in Emerald Bay and the Mysis in Lake Tahoe. The Emerald Bay Mysis basically have a 1-year lifespan, which means if something does happen to disrupt reproduction in a particular year, you've lost them. They disappear because reproduction fails and very few are born. Lake Tahoe, on the other hand, Mysis have a 3 to 4 year lifespan where they only reproduce in that final year. So if you have the same event in Lake Tahoe with a reproductive failure 1 year, no big deal. Next year, there's a quarter of the Mysis are still there to reproduce. So what we think happened is there was a reproductive failure. We looked at the data. There seemed to be no external factors, the hydrology, the meteorology, the nutrients, the chemicals, nothing that we're aware of caused it. So that was one question. And then now there's a question for Yuan, actually from the same person. This person happens to have 4 dogs, and he is offering to he is volunteering his dogs to do some taste trials of these Mysis treats. So his real question is, what have we done by way of taste trials and taste testing and things like that? So Yuan, did you want to put your microphone back on and address that question?
Yeah, definitely. Can you hear me okay?
I can, so I presume everybody can.
Great. Yeah, that is a great question. So our number one kind of priority first off is food safety. So we are actually going through the process currently of doing all of the due diligence on testing to make sure that we know exactly what is in the Mysis from a nutritional, microbial, and everything else standpoint. So we definitely want to have that box checked before we do any sort of broader taste testing and sensory analysis. Having said that, we ourselves have been doing a lot of eating of dog food, and there have been a few dogs out there that have, and dog owners who have been willing to go ahead and try some of the very early initial prototypes, even pre some of that testing. And I would say that 100% of the dogs that have tasted it have loved it so far. So I think we'll definitely be looking for early adopters who want to help us with sensory analysis and testing. So once we have all of the nutritional, microbial, food safety elements done, we will be reaching out. And if you guys are interested, your dog can be a part of kind of this story and making it happen.
Okay, thanks, Yuan. All right, moving on to another question, and this relates to the Tahoe Keys. And many of you know Tahoe Keys has a range of pretty important and extreme issues. And the question was, if Daphnia were successfully brought back through the elimination of Mysis, could they help restore or maintain the Tahoe Keys? Don't know. It's a great question. What we do know about Daphnia is that they're incredibly resilient. Their temperature tolerance, for example, goes up to about 35 degrees Celsius. Those of you not familiar with, or comfortable with Celsius, currently the lake temperature is about 21 degrees, 22 degrees. So they can sustain themselves and reproduce in the very warm waters of Tahoe Keys. So certainly they potentially could play a large role there, but we won't know till we have them back there. Another question, and I'm presuming this one is for me too, and this is from one of our former staff members. What I mentioned before is that the reason Daphnia helped keep Tahoe clear is that they were very good at choosing to eat this very small diatom, Cyclotella. And the question is, algal species come and go if we had a shift from this Cyclotella to something else. How do we know Daphnia would like them? We all have our preferences. Well, from what I've learned about Daphnia, and believe me, 5 years ago, I did not think I would be reading literature on Daphnia to the extent I am now. But what I have learned is they're not very selective. Unlike you and me, we sort of pick at our food possibly and choose the things we like. They more or less shovel food into their mouths. What they don't care for, or what's inedible, like silt. I mean, they can't really eat silt, but they shovel it into their mouth, they excrete. So my feeling is, as long as what replaces Cyclotella is in that size range. Remember, they're 100 units long, the Daphnia. So as long as that alga are less than, say, 5 or 10 microns in size, they will eat them. Okay, another question related to if the Mysis were removed, how quickly would clarity return? Good question. At Emerald Bay, when that happened, in 2 years, we had a 20-foot improvement in clarity. So going from 40 feet up to 60 feet. And that was just in 2 years. We don't know the extent to which that would have continued, or whether it would have taken another, if the absence of Mysis would have been sustained for 5 or 10 years, how quickly that rate would have, or whether that rate would have been sustained. But looking at the data that we have for Tahoe right now, we may get an improvement just with current business as usual efforts taking place of 5 or 10 feet in a year, but then we just as quickly get a return to what it was the previous year. It goes down 6 or 8 feet. So the fact that Mysis could sustain a 20-foot improvement over 2 years shows a lot of promise. And I should add that all the modeling, all the work that was done on removal of fine particles at Lake Tahoe, it had an estimate of it taking something like 40 years to return to full clarity. So even the original plan, it was a long-term process. With Daphnia, the removal of Mysis, there is potential for that timescale to be greatly accelerated. But again, it's its potential. We're hoping we, as we learn more, we're going to realize whether that potential can be realized. Okay, sorting through some of these questions. There's a question about estimates of the quantities that may be removed. So if some form of commercial harvesting is successful or does start, what sort of initial volumes are you expecting to remove, and in the long term, when this sort of ramps up to a sustainable level, what's the end game in the harvesting? Yuan.
Sure, yeah, I can speak to that. So based on our estimates that Turk has done on the population in Emerald Bay, the initial kind of pilot trawl would probably produce enough mice, harvest enough mysis to produce maybe about 12,000 like 4-ounce bags of dog treats based on our current estimates. So not a lot, but again, it would just be a pilot launch. As we ramp up from there, it really becomes a question of how quickly are we trying to suppress the mysis, right? So that becomes the question if we're using 2 vessels, 3 vessels, it just kind of depends from there. And I saw some questions on there about kind of the long-term goal of this. Well, one of the reasons we wanted to set this up as a nonprofit is our long-term goal is to suppress the mysis so that they're not a problem anymore, right? And so if we end up, putting ourselves out of business or moving to another lake somewhere else, and then coming back as needed, I think that's totally fine. The goal, number one goal, is really about the environment.
Okay, and so while you have your microphone on, I guess two follow-up questions. And these have been my questions to you in the past as well. What about cat food and what about human food?
Yeah, definitely. So I think both of those are avenues we could explore in the future. Just to kind of simplify things from an initial go-to market strategy, we chose dog treats to start with. Just gives us a little bit more of a focus. And I think that kind of missional momentum from a partnering and targeting standpoint. I think cat treats definitely an opportunity out there in the future. Cats tend to be a little bit more picky about what they eat. And the treat market is not as large, but it is there. And then from a human side, with my cooking, I don't know how much of this mysis you're going to be able to sell, but if we get it in the hands of a quality chef, I think there's potentially something we could do there.
Okay, thank you. So actually, we just have time for one last question. So I'm taking one that I know comes from the Midwest. And it's great that there are people participating in this from outside the Tahoe Basin. And it's more of a scientific question about the patchiness of the mysid. I mean, are they everywhere in Tahoe, or you have to go out and hunt for them? And yeah, so on and so forth. We did, as part of the pilot project that I talked about earlier, we did a lot of surveys. Most of them were in Emerald Bay. In Emerald Bay, we could do surveys with sonar equipment. So essentially very, very fancy fish finders. And we could locate the depths and the density of mysis throughout Emerald Bay. We could do, in 3 hours at night, we could do 10 or 12 passes of different transects in Emerald Bay and have a very good estimate of patchiness and numbers. Lake Tahoe, it's 100 times bigger. To take one transect across Lake Tahoe takes about 4 hours. And what you have is patchiness along a line. And then for another 3 or 4 hours, we could go back and do the same thing again. So yes, it is very patchy. We're trying to understand where they are so that when trawling does spin up, trawlers aren't wasting time looking for them. So what we've been experimenting with are autonomous vehicles that actually have this sonar equipment on board. They're going out ahead of the trawlers. They're locating the patches so that when the trawler leaves port at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, it knows exactly where to go. With time and with experience, and possibly with the help of predictive models, we'll start to know at different phases of the moon, possibly different times of year, where Mysis are going to congregate. So this is one of the, I guess, one of the questions related to upscaling. There is still a lot of knowledge that is needed. So at this point, our time has run out. I wanted to thank everybody again for participating. I really wanted to thank our two speakers, Harold Schmitz and Yuan Cheng, not just for presenting today, but for Yuan, for all the work that he's been doing over the last year and his leadership in this whole commercialization venture. And Harold has been giving us advice based on his experience in the food industry and in academic research for his whole career. So we appreciate that. We do, again, we will try to answer the questions offline via email, and we would welcome people continuing to engage with us, asking us questions, giving us ideas. This is something we hope you will participate in whatever way you can, whether it's through your ideas or whether you really want to get engaged in this very grassroots venture. Part of what we have to do now is raise the funds for going forward with this. So if you feel you have a way or ideas to help us in doing this, we would appreciate hearing them. Again, one final reminder, 12 o'clock next Thursday, July 30th, State of the Lake Report. It will be a very different presentation than today, but we hope you will be able to join us. So thank you, have a good day, stay healthy, and hope to see you throughout the summer.